The grit of the Sahara was still grinding between my molars when the American sergeant shoved the cold barrel of an M1 Garand against the base of my skull. I tasted copper and diesel. It was May 1943 in the scorched rocks of Tunisia. I closed my eyes, waiting for the lead, certain the stories of execution were true. The click of the safety was a sharp mechanical finality that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my forehead toward the burning grit of the Tunisian soil, waiting for the white flash that would silence the constant, gnawing roar of the war. I expected a kick, a curse, or the sudden hot arrival of a lead slug. My breath came in shallow, jagged hitches, each one catching in a throat so dry it felt like it was lined with broken glass. Seconds bled into a minute, marked only by the frantic thrumming of my pulse against the underside of my jaw. The expected blow never landed. Instead, I felt a heavy, cold weight of the M1 Garand's muzzle slide upward, dragging across my scalp before lifting away entirely. The sudden absence of the steel felt like a loss of gravity. I swayed, my hollow chest collapsing as I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding.
Get up, Fritz. You're no good to me face down in the dirt. I ain't digging a hole for you in this heat.
I opened my eyes, the glare of the African sun stabbing at my vision until the world was nothing but dancing yellow spots and harsh, jagged shadows. I forced my hands higher into the air, my fingers stiff and trembling. The salt-crusted sleeves of my tunic, stiff with months of dried sweat and Mediterranean spray, scraped painfully against my wrists. Every button I had left felt like a lead weight, and the two missing from my midsection allowed the hot, parched wind to lick at my sunken belly.
I said move it. Stand up on them bird legs of yours. Let's go. We got a long walk to the collection point, and my feet already hurt.
I pushed against the earth, my palms burning as they pressed into the sharp limestone. My knees screamed, the joints grinding like ungreased gears. When I finally stood, the horizon tilted dangerously. The scorched rocks of the valley swayed, and for a moment I thought I would collapse into the American's boots. He was a solid wall of olive-drab wool, standing with a casual posture that suggested he wasn't afraid of me at all. He smelled of something impossibly clean, a sharp mint of helpum.
Steady now. I didn't haul you out of that foxhole just to watch you faint. You eaten today, kid? You look like a ghost in a hand-me-down suit.
I stared at him, my sunken blue eyes wide and clouded with a confusion that bordered on terror. I didn't understand all the words, but the tone wasn't the bark of a sergeant major looking for a reason to strike a subordinate. It was something else, a rough, impatient sort of curiosity. I shook my head slowly, the movement making my brain feel like it was rattling inside a hollow gourd. The hunger wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a physical occupant of my body, a cold member of Waybode's considered metrop as off, and self as process.
Figures. Your lot's been living on dust and prayer for a month. Walk toward that ridge. If you stop, I'll have to poke you with this toothpick, and I'm too tired for the exercise.
I began to shuffle forward, my boots' soles worn down to the thickness of a communion wafer, crunching rhythmically on the shale. Each step was an exercise in pure will. I waited for the shot to come from behind. That was the story Major Krause had told us back in the palm groves, that the Americans would let you walk 10 paces toward freedom before putting a round through your spine for sport. I counted the steps. 1, 2, 3. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate to escape the cage of my chest. We reached the crest of the ridge where the wind blew harder, carrying the scent of salt and gasoline. Below us, a line of Studebaker trucks sat idling, their exhausts puffing blue smoke into the shimmering heat. They looked sturdy, well-maintained, and fueled by a bottomless supply of oil we hadn't seen since the winter. The sheer scale of their equipment made my stomach sink further. We had been fighting with baling wire in desperation. They were fighting with a factory.
Hold up. Stop right there, Eisenhardt.
I froze, my boots skidding on the loose rock. My name. He had read it off the frayed tag pinned to my tunic. I turned, my body feeling fragile as dry parchment. I waited for the cold iron to return to the base of my skull. I closed my eyes again, bracing for the impact, picturing the way the Tunisian dust would finally taste when my face hit it for the last time.
Keep them hands where I can see 'em. I'm reaching for something. Don't get jumpy.
He reached into a deep pocket on his trousers and pulled out a small, heavy square wrapped in shimmering silver foil. He held it out toward me, the metal glinting with a brightness that made my eyes water.
Take it. It's chocolate. Tastes like a brick, but it'll keep you upright until we get you processed. Go on, take it before I change my mind.
My fingers, trembling and stained with the grease of a dozen failed engines, reached out. The foil was cool, a miracle of manufacturing. I peeled back the edge, and the aroma hit me. Not the thin chemical smell of our Ursids rations, but something deep, rich, and undeniably real. It was the first time I realized the stories we were told might all be lies. The sweetness was an assault, a violent burst of sugar and fat that made my vision swim in my stomach, cramp in sudden panicked protest. I didn't chew. I simply held the square against the roof of my mouth, letting the heat of my feverish breath melt it into a thick, dark syrup that coated my throat. It was the taste of a world that still had factories, sugarcane, and peace. A flavor so heavy it felt like it might sink me right through the wooden planks of the pier.
Easy there, Eisenhart. You look like you're about to pass out on my boots, and I just polished them this morning. Keep those legs moving. The USS General Stewart doesn't wait for stragglers, even the ones who look like they've been spit out by a ghost.
He nudged me forward, his hand surprisingly firm against my shoulder blade, guiding me toward the towering gray wall of the transport ship. The gangplank was a narrow, swaying tongue of wood and rope that vibrated with the mechanical heartbeat of the vessel. As I stepped onto it, the smell of the harbor, a mixture of rotting kelp, diesel exhaust, and the brine of the Atlantic, filled my lungs, replacing the lingering scent of the chocolate with the cold reality of the sea.
Move it along, boys. Single file. Keep your eyes on the man in front of you and your hands where we can see him. We've got a long walk across a big puddle, and I'd prefer we did it without anyone taking a swim.
I reached for the rope railing, my fingers scraping against the rough sisal. My uniform, once a proud olive green but now the color of dead weeds and crusted with the salt of the Mediterranean, felt like a shroud. I looked up at the hull, the steel plates weeping rust like old wounds, and a sudden paralyzing dread seized my chest. I knew what lay beneath those waves. I knew the gray wolves of the Kriegsmarine were out there, silent and predatory, and the irony of being sent to the bottom, by Deweyli.
I said, watch it. Grab him, someone. He caught me by the crook of my elbow before I could slide, his grip tightening enough to bruise my thin arm. What's the matter, kid? You seasick already? We haven't even cast off the lines.
I couldn't find the English words to tell him that I was afraid of the silence. In the desert, death was loud. The scream of a Stuka, the rhythmic thud of an 88, the whistle of a mortar. But here, as we descended into the bowels of the ship, the world became muffled, trapped behind inches of cold steel. The air in the hold was thick and humid, smelling of 500 unwashed bodies, wet wool, and the metallic tang.
Find a bunk. Any bunk. They're stacked 4 high, so if you've got a weak bladder, I suggest you take the bottom. If you're a puker, take the top. And for God's sake, keep your gear tucked in. The Navy doesn't like a mess.
I climbed into a middle bunk, the canvas sagging beneath my meter weight. The man above me was already sobbing, a low rhythmic sound that was lost in the deeper vibration of the ship's engines. I lay on my back, my nose inches from the underside of the bunk above, staring at a small hand-painted U.S. stencil. The silence of the ocean began to press in from the outside, a vast watery void that felt more dangerous than any minefield. I realized then that we were no longer soldiers, we were cargo being moved across a world that had grown too large, as all is.
He walked down the narrow aisle, the soles of his boots clacking sharply against the deck plates. A sound of authority that seemed absurd in this floating cage. He stopped at the end of my row, leaning against a support stanchion and lighting a cigarette. The match flared, a tiny sun in the gloom, and the smell of real tobacco, rich, spicy, and abundant, wafted over us.
I watched the smoke curl toward the ventilation duct. In Germany, we were told the Americans were soft, that they were a nation of shopkeepers and jazz players who would crumble under the iron will of the Reich. But as I watched the guards stand there, relaxed but vigilant, and I thought of the chocolate still coating my teeth, I felt a terrible, hollow realization. They weren't soft, they were simply fed. They had so much that they could give candy to their enemies, while we had been fighting for scraps of bread in the sand. The silence of the Atlantic wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the sound of a world that had already moved on without us. The vibration of the ship's massive diesel engines changed pitch, moving from a deep, chest-thumping roar to a hesitant, coughing thrum that made the rivets in the bulkhead groan. Stow that gear, Eisenhart, and get your heels clicking. We're pulling into the pier, and the harbor pilots don't like to be kept waiting by a ship full of sleeping krauts. I stood up, my knees cracking like dry kindling, and felt the familiar, agonizing pinch of my salt-crusted tunic with a frayed collar rubbed against the raw skin of my neck. I followed the line of hunched shoulders and hollow-eyed men up the steep metal companionway, my boots sliding on the slick, oil-darkened steps until I reached the open air of the deck. Keep the line moving. Don't go bunching up at the rail like a pack of nervous hens. I ignored him, my breath catching in a throat that felt as though it were lined with desert sand, because as I looked out over the railing, the world was on fire, but not with the orange, hungry flame of a phosphorus bomb. It was light, a staggering, impossible ocean of yellow and white electricity that stretched from the water's edge until it vanished into the black curve of the earth. Close your mouth, kid. You'll catch a Virginia swamp fly if you keep gawking like that. I couldn't close it, my jaw hanging slack as I stared at the skyscrapers of Norfolk every single window a bright, defiant rectangle of gold that mocked the very concept of a blackout. In Berlin, we had lived in a world of blue-tinted bulbs and heavy velvet curtains, where a single sliver of light from a stray shutter could bring the wrath of the block warden, or the scream of a British Lancaster. Here the lights were naked, shouting to the stars that they had no fear of the sky, no fear of the Luftwaffe, and no fear of the men who stood shivering on the deck of a transport ship. Welcome to the land of the free Eisenhart. Looks a bit different than the ruins Goebbels told you about, doesn't it? The smell of the land reached me then, cutting through the stagnant stench of the ship's hold. It was the scent of wet asphalt, the heavy roasted aroma of real coffee, and the sweet sickly tang of blooming clover from somewhere far beyond the docks. I watched a crane swing over the pier, its movements fluid and powerful, illuminated by massive floodlights that turned the night into a garish artificial moon. Moved toward the gangplank, nice and easy. One at a time. My boots hit the wooden planks of the pier with a hollow thud that vibrated up my shins, the solid ground feeling treacherous and alien after weeks of the Atlantic's heaving belly. A truck rumbled past on a nearby street, its headlights two blinding silver spears that sliced through the dark, and I instinctively flinched, waiting for the whistle of an incoming shell that never came. Relax, son. That's just a delivery driver. The only thing hitting you tonight is the humidity. I looked at a neon sign hanging over a small shack at the edge of the pier. It flickered in a rhythmic, pulsing red, spelling out "eat" in a language I barely understood, but a tone I recognized perfectly. It was a boast, a flashing crimson proof that they had so much energy to waste that they could use it to decorate the air for a common kitchen. I looked down at my hands, the skin stretched thin over my knuckles, and then at the American soldiers standing on the dock. They were leaning against crates, laughing, their uniforms crisp and their faces glowing with the health of men who had never known the gnawing, sharp teeth of real hunger. Don't just stand there admiring the scenery. We got a train to board and a long night ahead of us. I turned my head, squinting against the brilliance of a street lamp, and saw a woman walking along the sidewalk just outside the fence. Her coat of vibrant, shocking blue that looked like a piece of the sky had fallen onto her shoulders. She wasn't looking at the sky for bombers. She was looking at her watch, her movements hurried but casual. A ghost from a world where time was measured in appointments rather than artillery barrages. "Hey, Eisenhart," I said, "move it." I felt Barney's hand on my shoulder, the weight of it grounding me, but as I marched toward the waiting rail cars, the lights of Norfolk began to blur through a sudden hot moisture in my eyes. They had told us the Americans were a dying race, a fractured people broken by the weight of their own greed. But as I stood in the middle of a city that burned brighter than 1,000 suns, I realized that we had been fighting a war against a giant that hadn't even felt the sting of our blades. Watch your step on the rail ties. They're slick with oil. I stepped into the shadow of the passenger car, the smell of coal smoke and warm grease wrapping around me. And for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't afraid of what was hidden in the dark. I was afraid of the light because the light showed me exactly how small and forgotten we really were. Sit. Not there, by the window. I want you where I can see your hands and the horizon at the same time. I lowered myself onto the bench, the vinyl seat, letting out a long, wheezing hiss as it took my weight. It felt disturbingly soft. For years, the only thing beneath my spine had been the vibrating steel of a troop transport or the jagged limestone of a foxhole. I rested my head against the glass and the vibration of the locomotive surged through my skull, a deep rhythmic thrumming that felt like the pulse of a massive hidden engine beneath the earth itself. The air in the car was stagnant, smelling of stale tobacco, floor wax, and the heavy metallic scent of coal smoke that drifted in through the vents. You look like you're seeing a ghost, kid. Lean back. The train isn't going to bite you, though the heat might try. I looked at my hands. They were trembling. I tried to still them by gripping the edge of my tunic, the salt-crusted olive fabric feeling like sandpaper against my skin. The missing buttons at my chest left me exposed, and I felt the draft from the overhead fans hitting my hollow ribs, a cold reminder of how little of me was left. I looked out the window as the train lurched forward, a violent jolt that sent a shudder through the entire carriage. The rail yard began to slide away, replaced by the sprawling, sun-bleached outskirts of a world I didn't recognize. Welcome to Texas. It's a lot of nothing, followed by a whole lot more of nothing. Just keep your eyes on the grass, but it wasn't nothing. As the city of Galveston faded into the shimmering heat haze, the land opened up into a vista that made my throat tighten. I expected ruins. I expected the charred skeletons of factories and the craters of a nation at war. Instead, I saw green. Endless, rolling waves of it. We passed a field where the corn stood taller than a man's head, the stalks thick and vibrant, their silk tassels catching the golden light like spun sugar. There were miles of it swaying in a gentle breeze that didn't carry the scent of cordite or rotting meat. It smelled of damp earth and life. That's just the beginning. The feedlots are coming up. You ever seen a cow that didn't have its ribs sticking out? I didn't answer because my tongue felt like a dry piece of leather in my mouth. A herd of cattle appeared near a watering hole, hundreds of them, their hides sleek and heavy with fat. They didn't scatter at the sound of the train. They simply stood there, chewing with a slow, rhythmic indifference. I thought of the half-starved horses we had eaten in the retreat, their flesh stringy and bitter with the taste of their own terror. Here, the animals lived in a luxury our generals couldn't have imagined. My stomach let out a low, hollow growl, a sharp pang of hunger that felt like a physical clawing against my spine. Easy there. Your belly's making more noise than the engine. Here, I can't have you fainting on me before we even return. He reached into a small canvas satchel and pulled out a white paper sack. The grease had soaked through the bottom, creating a translucent circle that shimmered in the light. He pulled out a sandwich. Thick slices of white bread, so white they looked like bleached linen, with a slab of pink ham peeking out from the edges. He didn't throw it. He held it out, waiting for me to take it. The smell hit me, the sweet, yeasty scent of fresh flour and the salt of the meat. It was an offensive amount of food for a single person. Take it, Eisenhart. Take it, Eisenhart. It's just ham. No poison, I promise. I don't fancy carrying a 100-pound German off this train because he starved to death out of spite. I reached out, my fingers brushing the warm paper. My hands were stained with the dust of 3 continents, and I felt a sudden, burning shame as I took the sandwich. In the Reich, we were told the Americans were starving, that their supply lines were broken by our U-boats, that they were a decadent race crumbling under the weight of their own greed. But as I looked out at the golden fields and the fat cattle, and held the soft, heavy weight of the white bread in my hand, I realized the lie wasn't in the window. The lie was everything I had ever been told. I took a bite, and the taste of real butter made the tears prick at the corners of my sunken eyes. We hadn't been fighting a war against an enemy. We had been fighting against a sun that refused to go out. The butter was a ghost on my tongue, a fatty golden haunting that made my stomach cramp with a sudden unaccustomed richness. Slow down, kid. You'll have the heaves before I can even get your serial number down on the intake form. I looked up at him, my throat working to swallow the last of the heavy white bread, and I felt a strange, prickly heat behind my eyes that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. Stand up straight now. Let's get you moved down the line. There's 100 more of you coming off the trucks, and I haven't got all day to watch you worship a sandwich. I pushed myself up from the wooden bench, my legs feeling like brittle stalks of dry wheat, and followed the broad tan back of the sergeant toward a long table littered with crates and stacks of olive drab fabric. Over here, Eisenhart, and keep your hands where I can see them. Not that you look like you've got the strength to pull a trigger, even if I handed you a Luger. The air inside the processing hut was thick with the smell of sawdust, floor wax, and the metallic tang of the corrugated tin roof, baking in the afternoon heat. He reached into a crate and pulled out a small, rectangular object wrapped in a pale, waxy paper that caught the light coming through the high windows. I watched his hands, huge, blunt-fingered hands that looked like they should be gripping the stock of a rifle or the handle of a sledgehammer, as he delicately peeled back the edge of the wrapper. Here, take this. The captain says you lot are to be scrubbed within an inch of your lives before you hit the barracks, and frankly, I agree with the captain. He held out the block, and for a moment I didn't move. My mind still stuck in the gray, gritty reality of the transport ship where everything smelled of diesel, vomit, and the slow rot of unwashed bodies. Take it, Eisenhart. It's not a grenade. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed his warm palm, and took the soap. It was surprisingly heavy. A dense, smooth weight that felt like a polished stone from the bottom of a river. I brought the bar toward my face, my nose twitching as the first hint of the scent pierced through the stale, salt-crusted stench of my own tunic. The world around me. The scratching of O'Neill's pen, the hum of the electric fans, the distant shouting of guards, simply vanished. It was lavender. It wasn't the chemical biting lavender of the disinfectant they used in the field hospitals, but the deep floral soul of the plant itself. Sweet and earthy and impossibly clean. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I wasn't a prisoner in a dust-choked camp in Texas. I was 8 years old, hiding in the bottom of the heavy oak linen closet in our house in Dusseldorf. I could feel the cool, crisp edges of my mother's Sunday tablecloths against my neck and hear the soft thump-thump of her footsteps in the hallway as she looked for me. She used to sew dried lavender into small muslin bags and tuck them between the sheets, telling me that the scent would keep the moths away and bring us good dreams, even when the wind howled off the Rhine. I pressed the soap against my nose, breathing in so deeply that my lungs ached, trying to find her in the molecules of the fragrance, trying to find the boy who hadn't yet learned how to march. "You all right there, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my eyes, and the sight of O'Neill's concerned face, framed by the utilitarian simplicity of his tan uniform, felt like a betrayal of everything I had been taught to believe. My instructors in the Hitler Youth had screamed until they were hoarse that the Americans were a race of barbarians, a cultureless mass of consumer-driven animals who knew nothing of the refined German spirit. Yet, in the middle of a war, in a camp for their enemies, they were handing out the smell of my mother's linen closet. They had enough of this luxury, this peace, to give it away to the very men who had tried to sink their ships. It's just soap, Eisenhart. Don't go getting sentimental on me. We've still got to get you through the delousing station. I looked at the soap, then back at the sergeant, and for the first time since I had been conscripted, the rigid, icy structure of my indoctrination began to crack, spiderwebbing with the realization that the decadent enemy possessed a kindness we had long ago burned for fuel. I gripped the bars so tight the edges dug into my palm, a small, fragrant anchor in a world that was finally starting to make sense, even as it fell apart. The gravel of the Texas motor pool crunched under my boots, a harsh, rhythmic grinding that felt like the gears of a world I no longer understood. I followed the broad, steady shadow of Sergeant O'Neill, my fingers still white-knuckled around that small, rectangular bar of ivory soap. It was heavier than it looked, or perhaps it was simply the weight of what it represented. A commodity we hadn't seen in the fatherland for years, something pure and white in a world turned to soot and iron. Step lively now, Eisenhart. The sun's already trying to bake us into the pavement, and I've got a dozen more of your compatriots waiting for their turn in the tubs. I didn't answer, mostly because my throat felt like it had been lined with the very sand of the El Alamein line. I looked down at my hands, the skin cracked and mapped with the grime of 3 continents, and then back at the sergeant's neck. He walked with a casual, rolling gait, his uniform crisp and smelling of laundry starch and tobacco. He didn't look like a man who had spent the morning rounding up the subhuman remnants of a defeated army. He looked like a man who was heading home to a hot dinner. In here, stripped down. Everything goes in the bin for the steamer. If you try to hide a souvenir, the chemicals will ruin it anyway, so don't be a hero. We entered a long, corrugated tin building that hummed with the sound of pressurized water and the low, guttural murmurs of other men who had forgotten what it felt like to be clean. The air inside was thick, a humid fog of sulfur, steam, and the sharp, medicinal tang of delousing powder. I stood there frozen until O'Neill nudged my shoulder with a blunt finger. I said, "Strip, son. You're not in the Wehrmacht anymore. You're just a very dirty guest of the United States government." I began to undo the buttons of my tunic, the salt-crusted olive fabric, stiff as cardboard. As the layers fell away, I felt a profound sense of exposure that had nothing to do with nakedness. My ribs stood out like the hull of a shipwrecked boat, my skin a sickly pale yellow where the sun hadn't reached it. I saw O'Neill's eyes flicker over my frame, the hollow chest, the scars from shrapnel on my thigh, and for a second, the professional distance in his gaze softened into something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Jesus, Eisenhart. They haven't been feeding you since the crate fell off the dock, have they?" I stepped into the spray of the shower, the water hitting my skin with a violence that made me gasp. It wasn't the lukewarm, oily trickle of the barracks in Tripoli. It was a torrent of hot, fresh water. I raised the bar of soap, watching as the first few drops of water turned it into a rich, white lather. I rubbed it against my chest, and the scent, clean, floral, and impossibly domestic, filled my nose. Use it all if you have to. We've got crates of the stuff in the warehouse. Don't go rationing it like it's gold. I paused, the soap suds sliding down my trembling arms. We had been told the Americans were a soft people, a degenerate mixture of cultures that would crumble under the iron will of the Reich. We were told they were starving, that their cities were in ruins, and that their abundance was a lie of the Jewish press. But as I stood there, surrounded by the roar of unlimited water and holding a bar of soap that O'Neill treated as garbage, the lie shattered. The lie shattered. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Eisenhart. It's just a shower." It wasn't just a shower. It was a defeat more absolute than any artillery barrage. I realized then that my leaders had not just lost the war, they had stolen the world from us. They had traded this simple human dignity of soap and warmth for the cold, dead glory of a 1,000-year empire that couldn't even wash its own soldiers. I closed my eyes and let the suds wash over my face, the salt of my tears lost in the American water. "All right, wrap it up. New fatigues are on the bench. Try to look like a human being when you come out." I stepped out of the stall, my skin stinging and pink, the first time I had felt truly warm in years. I reached for the coarse, clean towel, but I didn't set the soap down. I tucked the small, dwindling nub of it into the pocket of the new denim trousers they gave me. I needed to keep it. I needed to remember the moment I realized that the enemy hadn't conquered us with hate, but with the terrifying, overwhelming power of being able to afford a little bit of mercy. I sit in my garden now, many decades removed from that Texas sun, watching the afternoon shadows stretch across the grass. My hands are gnarled, the skin is thin and translucent as the parchment of an old letter, but if I close my eyes and breathe deeply, I can still find it. That faint, ghostly scent of lavender. It is a scent that shouldn't belong to a soldier, yet it became the only thing that could bridge the chasm between the boy I was, filled with a hateful, brittle pride, and the man I was meant to become. The characters, incidents, and dialogue in this video are dramatized for narrative and entertainment effect. While some events may be inspired by real-life themes, this story is a work of fiction.